Okay, welcome back once again. We're getting close to the end of the history book here. Chapter 17, Section 3, beginning on page 528. This section is titled The South During Reconstruction. American Diary. John Roy Lynch, once enslaved, ran a business in Mississippi. In the 1869 election, the first in which African Americans could vote, Lynch was elected to the Mississippi state legislature. Lynch later recalled that, quote, the campaign was aggressive. The election resulted in a sweeping Republican victory. The party not only elected the state ticket, but also had a large majority in the state legislature, close quote. From Reminiscence of an Active Life, the autobiography of John Roy Lynch. Reconstruction Politics, main idea. As African Americans began to take part in civic life in the South, they faced resistance, including violence from whites. History and you. Do some people today use mean names to refer to someone they don't like? Read to learn what former Confederates called Republican supporters in the South. During Reconstruction, Republicans dominated Southern politics. Support for the Republican Party came from African Americans, while Southerners who supported Republican policies and white settlers from the North. These groups were in charge of the state governments. African Americans in government. African Americans played an important role in Reconstruction politics, both as voters and as elected officials. In some states, they contributed heavily to Republican victories. African Americans did not control any state government, although they briefly held a majority in the lower house of the South Carolina legislature. In other southern states, they held important positions, but never in proportion to their numbers. At the national level, 16 African Americans served in the House of Representatives and 2 in the Senate between 1869 and 1880. Hiram Revels, one of the African American senators, was an ordained minister who had recruited African Americans for the Union Army. He also started a school for freed African Americans in Missouri and served as chaplain of an African American regiment in Mississippi. Revels remained in Mississippi after the war and was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1870. Blanche K. Bruce, the other African American senator, also came from Mississippi. A former escaped slave, Bruce taught in a school for African Americans in Missouri when the war began. In 1869, he went to Mississippi, entered politics, and was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1874. Scallywags and carpetbaggers. Some southern states, such as pro-union business leaders and non-slave-holding farmers, backed the Republicans. Former Confederates called them scallywags, a term meaning scoundrel or worthless rascal. Many northern whites who moved to the South after the war also supported the Republicans. Critics called these northerners carpetbaggers because they arrived with all their belongings in cheap suitcases made of carpet fabric. Although some carpetbaggers were dishonest, most were not. Many were reformers who wanted to help the South. Many Southerners accused Reconstruction governments of corruption or dishonest or illegal actions. Although some officials made more money illegally, probably less corruption occurred in the South than in the North. Resistance to Reconstruction. Most Southern states opposed efforts to expand African American rights. Life soon became difficult for African Americans. Most white landowners refused to rent land to freed people. Store owners refused them credit, extra time to pay for goods, and employers would not hire them. Secret societies such as the Ku Klux Klan used fear and violence to deny rights to freed men and women. Wearing white sheets and hoods, Klan members killed thousands of African Americans and their white friends. They beat and wounded many more and burned African American homes, schools, and churches. Many Southerners, especially planters and Democrats, backed the Klan. These people who had the most to gain from the return of white supremacy saw violence as a defense against Republican rule. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed several laws to try to stop the growing violence of the Klan. These laws met with limited success. Most white Southerners refused to testify against those who attacked African Americans and their white supporters. Reading check. Explaining. Who were the scalawags and carpetbaggers? Why did many Southerners resent them? Education and farming. Main idea. Education improved for both races in the South, but the sharecropping system limited economic opportunities for African Americans. History and you. If you could not attend school, how would the course of your life change? Read about advances in education in the South. During Reconstruction, African Americans created their own schools. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped spread education. Northern women and African Americans came south to teach in schools. In the 1870s, Reconstruction governments created public schools for both races. Within a few years, about 50% of white children and 40% of African American children in the South were enrolled. Northern missionary societies set up academies, schools for special training. These academies grew into a network of African American colleges and universities, including Fisk University in Tennessee and Morehouse College in Georgia. Generally, African Americans and white students attended different schools. Only a very few states required that schools be integrated, include both whites and African Americans, but the laws were not enforced. Along with education, most freed people wanted land. Some African Americans purchased land with the help of the Freedmen's Bank, but most failed to get their own land. The most common form of framework for freed people was sharecropping. In this system, a landowner rented a plot of land to a sharecropper or farmer along with a crude shack, some seeds and tools, and perhaps a mule. In return, sharecroppers shared a percentage of their crops with the landowners. After paying the landowners, sharecroppers often had little left to sell. Sometimes there was barely enough to feed their families. For many, sharecropping was little better than slavery. Reading check. Describing. What was the relationship between sharecroppers and landowners? Section 3, review. Vocabulary. Number 1. Define each of the following terms: scallywag, carpetbagger, corruption, credit, academy, integrate, sharecropping. Main ideas. Number 2. Specifying. What kinds of resistance did African Americans face as they tried to exercise their rights as citizens in the South? Number 3. Describing. How did Reconstruction governments reform education in the South? Okay, that wraps it up for Chapter 16, Section 3. Coakley out.